So, welcome to the latest in our guest lecture series at the Belfast Summer School for 2021. I have the great pleasure of introducing our guest speaker this afternoon, Professor Shadi Bartsch from the University of Chicago. Just to tell you a little bit, a very brief bio. I can't fit all of our accolades into one go, but I just want to give you a little bit of information to introduce our speaker so you know exactly how lucky we are to have her with us here this afternoon. Her research interests include Roman literature of the 1st century AD, the Stoic philosopher Seneca, and more recently the way that the Western classics are being received in contemporary China. So an impressive record, to say the least. She has produced numerous works such as Actors in the Audience, Ideology in Cold Blood, and The Mirror of the Self. Just expressing some of the titles, just a few of the titles under her belt. Her new book on China and the Western tradition will come out in 2022, so that's definitely one to watch out for. And being a dog lover myself, those of you in beginner's Greek with me who are interrupted on a regular basis by my dog Max making a ruckus in the background. I have to mention, since she told me this, that Shadi has 2 dire wolves. I'm certainly envious, since I'm also not just a fan of dogs, but also a fan of Game of Thrones. So I find that fascinating. We are delighted here at Belfast Classics to have Professor Bartsch here with us today. So without further delay, I will pass you over to our speaker as she introduces us to Aeneas Polytropos. Thank you, Shadi.
Thank you so much, Carrie, and thank you also to Helen, who cannot be here, and thank you to all of you who are here for popping in to hear about Aeneas on a Tuesday afternoon, I think. I will speak for about 35 minutes, and then I will open up for questions. And for most of that time, I will be sharing my screen with you, and then I will come back in person at the end. So let me first see if I have yet learned how to share my screen on Zoom, which after a year I should have. Come on. Okay. If there's anything not working, Carrie, thumbs up.
Good.
Okay, super. All right, so as most of you will know, my title today, Aeneas Polytropos, steals the epithet famously applied to Odysseus in the first line of the Odyssey, where Homer starts with the words andramoi enepe musa polytropon, sing to me, muse of the man of many wiles. And of course, polytropos here in the Odyssey is not meant to be critical. In the Greek context, it's positive to be wily, to be able to turn around in a tight spot and make up good stories. But should I be applying the adjective polytropos, wily, to Virgil's hero Aeneas? Surely not. For there is another adjective that characterizes Aeneas right from the beginning of the Aeneid, and I think you all know very well what that is. Of course, it's pious. Okay. Very close to the beginning of the epic, Virgil tells us, remember from me muse, tell me the reasons, what pain, what insult to her power, moved the queen of gods to drive a man famous for piety, that would be Aeneas, through misery on misery. Can such anger grip God's minds? So at the very opening of the epic, Virgil points out, like Homer before him, the principal characteristic of his epic hero. And Aeneas goes on to be associated with piety some 20 other instances in the Aeneid. Aeneas even calls himself pious when he presents himself to others. When he meets his mother disguised as a huntress in Book 1, after landing at Carthage, the first words out of his mouth are, sum pius Aeneas, I'm pious Aeneas. It's almost as if it were crucial to him that everybody should know of his identity prior to even getting to know the man. Now, much of this emphasis on piety is actually Virgil's innovation. The tradition of the piety does go back to Homer and the visual arts, but there it is highly restricted in its meaning. In Homer, for example, where Aeneas pops up only a few times, he's considered to be a good observer of religious ritual. In Book 20 of the Iliad, Poseidon describes him as Aeneas, quote, who always gives the most pleasing gifts to the gods who hold sway over the broad heaven, end quote. So here, he's characterized by nice gifts to the gods. On Greek pottery, we often see him rescuing his father, an act also considered to be morally praiseworthy by any standards. But Roman pietas is richer than this, as post-Virgilian art makes clear. It is a deeply Roman concept that stands for multiple loyalties, multiple pieties, to the native gods, to your own family, and to your native country. So here, for example, you will see Aeneas with son, father, and even often the household gods in a box held by his father, Anchises, which is particularly clear, I think, in images 2 and 3. And in the poem itself, his piety has often been said to be the driver of many of Aeneas's acts, most famously his leaving Dido in Book 4 in obedience to Jupiter's will, an abandonment that drives her to suicide. Not all of Virgil's readers are happy about having a pious hero. The usual complaint is that Aeneas is boring, at least compared to Achilles and Odysseus. At any rate, if we continue the contrast with Odysseus, I think we can safely say that Aeneas's quality of piety is certainly different from craftiness or wiliness or the ability to tell lies that is characteristic of the Homeric hero. So even if the Aeneid as a poem is thought to conceal within itself both of Homer's poems, the Odyssey and the Iliad, in reverse order, with the first half Odyssean as Aeneas travels and the second half Iliadic as he fights, nevertheless, Aeneas would seem to have little to do with Odysseus besides his travel. It's puzzling then that our first sight of Aeneas is designed to recall Odysseus just after Odysseus has left Calypso's island in Book 5 of the Odyssey, basically the first time we see Odysseus in action as well. As you can see from the slide, our first introduction to both of them is fear and a wish that they had died in Troy. Aeneas groaned and held up both hands to the stars, 3 and 4 times fortunate, all you who died by Troy's high walls under your father's gaze. I wish I'd fallen on Troy's fields. And then he goes on to say he wishes he'd been killed specifically by Diomedes. Meanwhile, Odysseus, when we meet him after he's gotten away from Calypso, is also caught in a storm and says 3 and 4 times more blessed, so exactly the same time, the same amount of blessedness, were all the Greeks who died in the vast land of Troy to please the sons of Atreus. Would that I had met a death like theirs, had shared their destiny. Is this similarity, just this opening echo, the only reason then that I've titled this talk Aeneas Polytropos, even though Aeneas is taken generally to be pious? The answer is, of course, no. Let me lay out 3 facts before you, all directly relevant to the question of just how this epithet pious is challenged and contextualized within the poem itself. So here are the 3 facts. Fact 1, there was a tradition about Aeneas that existed before Virgil wrote the Aeneid. In this tradition, Aeneas is actually the person who betrays Troy to the Greeks. Sometimes he's acting with Antenor, sometimes he's buddies with Odysseus on the other side, but he's the traitor. Fact 2, Virgil in this poem refers to the negative prior tradition very often in the Aeneid, even if he also calls his hero pious, which is very strange. Fact 3, our Aeneas in Virgil lies a lot. I refer to moments in which, in his own voice, he directly contradicts something he said to another character earlier, or states a fact that we know is false from our experience of the narrative. And in both cases, these lies are in his own interest. What is the accumulated outcome of these three facts? Well, let's look at them more closely. Fact one, the references to alternative traditions in which Aeneas is a traitor who hands Troy over to the Greeks would have been well known to Virgil's contemporaries. They knew of this tradition. One of them, Virgil's rough contemporary Dionysius of Halicarnassus, tells us in his Roman Antiquities that Aeneas abandoned the city, taking with him the holy statues of the gods and all the valuables he could carry away. That's in Roman Antiquities 146. According to Dionysius, the Greeks then stipulated that Aeneas and his people had to leave Troy ASAP, as soon as possible. But before that, before they were granted safe passage, they had to deliver up the outlying Trojan forts to the Greeks, and only then would the Greeks allow them safe conduct by land and sea. This is Roman Antiquities 147. So in this version of the story, which Dionysius actually calls the most reliable of the many versions floating around, Aeneas betrays unspecified Trojan forts in exchange for safe passage and treasure. A slightly more positive story related by Varro and going back to Lycophron's 3rd century BC poem Alexandra does stress Aeneas's piety, but says that he was judged most pious by the Greek enemy, not by the Trojans. The Greeks liked him because his only desire, as expressed to them, was to save his father. And they were so impressed by this filial piety, the story goes, that they allowed him to save others of his family and to take Trojan treasure and the statues of the gods out of the city with safe passage. So again, not really a figure who we would think of as pious by normative standards, but somebody who is engaging in unsavory negotiations with the Greeks. And there are many, many versions of Aeneas as a traitor. They all differ slightly about what he did and where he went. But we'll stop here in the interests of time. So let's go to fact two. You would not expect this pre-Virgilian tradition of a traitor to make an appearance in our Virgilian Aeneid. And yet, as recent scholars have seen, references to this tradition do appear quite often, usually as details that make little sense in the context of the new rehabilitated Aeneas story, but that should trigger recollection of the older stories as the readers come across them. Whenever this happens in the text, Virgil's ancient commentators, Servius and Donatus, note the problem, but tell us, the readers, that we should definitely not be thinking of the prior tradition as we read this. Of course, the question is, why would we be thinking of that tradition unless Virgil had primed us in the first place? For example, when we find Aeneas gazing at himself among the Greek leaders, so he sees himself among the Greek leaders on a frieze of the Trojan War on the temple of Juno in Dido's Carthage, Servius pops up to say that one might think of the tradition in which Aeneas helped the Greeks, since he's here with the Greeks. Oops. But, but Virgil means for us not to think about it. And in fact, Aeneas later tries to explain it away in his story to Dido. Earlier, at the mention of the traitor Antenor's escape from Troy, Servius again brings up the Aeneas traitor tradition to point out, helpfully, that Aeneas is not with the traitor Antenor this time around. And when the narrator actually compares Aeneas to a robber or a brigand at the beginning of book 12, Servius jumps in to say that Virgil doesn't really mean to say anything negative about Aeneas. Here, the word brigand just means a hunter, Okay, no negative connotation. So Servius, at least, seems desperate to control our reading experience and to make sure that every time we're nudged towards remembrances of the prior Aeneas, we tell ourselves, no, no, you can't think that, right? It's a very controlling strategy. There are even more examples of these sneaky backward-looking glances to the previous Aeneas. In Book 1, Aeneas has gifts fetched for Dido. And here, the effect, I think, of our knowing the Iliad and the Odyssey lulls us into an acceptance of this moment of Virgilian uncanny, because we think, well, of course, guests and hosts exchange gifts. That's the nature of epic society. So at first glance, we may be unsurprised when Aeneas sends Achates to fetch those gifts in Book 1. They're quite lavish. A cloak stiff with golden thread, a veil edged with saffron-dyed acanthus, Argive Helen's finery, taken from Mycenae when she left for Troy and her illicit marriage, her mother Leda's gorgeous gifts. Also, a scepter that once belonged to Priam's eldest daughter, Ilione, a necklace set with pearls, a crown ringed twice with gold and gems. At this display, the Carthaginians are quite amazed, mirantur in the Latin. Perhaps this is because the gifts are very fine indeed, but perhaps it is because they wonder how Aeneas laid his hands on such items as he fled from Troy. A scepter from Priam's eldest daughter? That's odd. Or perhaps they're surprised because of how Aeneas himself describes himself to Dido when he's begging her to take the Trojans in. He says, "We few left by the Greeks, worn out on land and sea by every blow, bereft of everything. We are destitute. Please take us in." As he tells her in his story of his escape from Troy, there was no time to take anything with him but his father, son, and household gods. He went straight from the desperate fight for burning Troy back to his house and family, and hence straight out of the city. The source of the gifts is inexplicable unless we recall that in another tradition, the Greeks rewarded Aeneas richly for his treachery. Later, the gifts become more dubious still. Aeneas will outdo his presents to Dido by the luxurious items that Ilioneus tallies up for King Latinus in Book 7. I quote, "With this gold cup, Anchises poured libations at the altar, and this was Priam's finery when he judged the nations, a sacred scepter and a diadem, and robes that Trojan women toiled to weave." End quote. An alert reader might ask, how did Aeneas get his hands on the treasures of the house of Priam, including Priam's own scepter? Was it after Neoptolemus stabbed Priam to death at the altar, an act Aeneas apparently witnessed? Did he descend from the roof of the palace to take his prize once Priam had been slaughtered and was lying dead and bloody by the altar? But no, of course not. At least not in Aeneas's own story. In that story, he tells Dido he and his men are destitute. They saved nothing from Troy, and he barely escaped the burning city with his life. Indeed, he lost his wife along the way. Or so he says. Meanwhile, the narrator in his own voice does confirm that the Trojans are carrying Trojan treasure with them, because when they are shipwrecked on the way to Carthage, there's Trojan treasure, Gaza, floating in the waves. Why two stories? Servius, of course, believed that we would indeed be troubled by the nature of these gifts, which of course seem to refer back to the story that Aeneas was given treasure for betraying Troy. So Servius hurries to offer us reassurance, as he does with all the other problematic instances of Aeneas's behavior in the epic. Here is his excuse for Aeneas. Quote, "The poet, Virgil, takes pains to prove by this Helen, who we all know betrayed Troy with Antenor from the conflagration caused by the war, and not as a reward for betrayal. So this somewhat bizarre explanation acknowledges that Aeneas has Trojan treasure with him, but says it's okay that he has a treasure because he snatched it from the burning city. He didn't get it from the Greeks, right? But in Aeneas's own voice earlier, he doesn't snatch anything from the burning city at all, right? So if Servius's thoughts turn so often to Aeneas the traitor, or to convincing us that Aeneas is not a traitor, why have we not been more troubled, for example, by these gifts? I think the answer is that we haven't been set up as readers to appreciate such facts, as well as Virgil's contemporary audience and his later commentators, because they knew the alternative stories about Aeneas, and we usually don't. I was certainly never taught about the alternative traditions when I was in college. And we also don't expect to find these kinds of problems in what we take to be a coherent, perhaps even propagandistic narrative. There's still more stuff in the poem that should trouble us, even if it hasn't. For example, pious Aeneas knows all sorts of weird stuff that he shares with Dido that he shouldn't actually know if his story is true. So, for example, he knows the order in which the Greeks came out of the Trojan horse. He says, oh, first Ulysses slid out, and then there was so-and-so, and then Epus, the architect of the horse, and then this guy, and then that guy. But how did he know the order in which the Greeks came out of the Trojan horse? On his own account, he was fast asleep at the time that this happened. He claims to be an eyewitness of Priam's murder. That's how he knows that Neoptolemus slew him at the altar as Priam slipped in his own blood. Well, why was he in the room, no matter, or on the roof looking down when Priam was murdered? And why didn't he try to help? This is all very strange. Is this when he grabbed the scepter? Who knows? So all of these, again, keep reminding us of the prior negative tradition. Finally, the Italians, too, the enemy, seem to recognize a different Aeneas, a different one from the one pious one that we know. Turnus, Juno, Amata, Mezentius, none of them are reluctant to allude to the traitor Aeneas and to suggest that he is waging not a just war after the betrayal of a treaty, but simply an aggressive attack against an undeserving people, the Italians. Turnus calls Aeneas the deserter of Asia. Oh dear. Juno refers to Aeneas as the invader who brings war and who hopes for war spoils from the foreign lands he will suppress, including the war spoil Lavinia. Amata despairs that Latinus is willing to marry their daughter to a treacherous brigand. And again, this is kind of a reference back to the fact that Paris stole Helen, and now Aeneas is going to be the same kind of person and steal Lavinia from Turnus. Mezentius likewise calls him a brigand when he vows to kill him, Prido, and even the Latin matrons who beg Pallas for help think of Aeneas as a brigand. It's very uncomplimentary. Now, of course, the pro-Aeneas faction will explain this away by saying, well, the Italians will say anything they want about Aeneas, right? They hate him. Okay, so they could say anything they want. But why do they keep saying things that seem to suggest he is specifically a traitor to Troy, as opposed to saying other things? Right? Okay. Finally, let's talk about fact 3. As I've claimed, Aeneas is a liar. How many times does he lie? The answer is a lot. He lies to Dido at least twice, and at that point, even the narrator tells us that he is preparing a trick, a dolus for Dido. This is when he tells his crew to get ready to leave Carthage, but to hide it from Dido, to dissimulate, in his words, to cover it up. When Dido learns of his plans, his dolus, she accosts him to protest. Sorry about the quality of this text. And essentially charges him with dissimulating, the very thing he's told his sailors to do, dissimulate and get ready. She says, why did you want to dissimulate this outrage? Why did you want to abandon me, right? But Aeneas denies that he ever lies. In his very legal language, a few points in response, I didn't try to sneak away from here, don't pretend I did. He actually flips the tables and thus accuses Dido of making things up. Don't pretend, right? And as he continues his remarks to Dido, Aeneas in fact claims that he planned to leave Carthage all along. He was never going to stay with Dido, and she shouldn't have expected it. At this, she practically bursts out laughing and mocks him as a liar. Who's right? Was Aeneas planning to leave? Or was he planning on staying? Well, on the authority of no less a figure than Jupiter, we're told he was planning on staying. The reason Jupiter has to send Mercury down to Aeneas and to tell him to leave Dido and continue with his mission to get to Italy is that, I'm quoting Jupiter's lines here, Aeneas expects a future in Tyre's Carthage and ignores the towns chosen by fate. So, well then, Aeneas clearly was not planning on leaving Troy. And Aeneas even lies to Dido when he encounters her in the underworld. And I feel so bad for her here, because when he's planning on leaving, she keeps telling him, if you leave, I'll kill myself, because otherwise Iarbas and the other local kings are going to invade Carthage and either take me as war booty or kill me. So I'm not going to wait for that. When you leave, I'm just going to kill myself, okay? And he bumps into her in the underworld in book 6. She's dead, of course, because she's in the underworld. And he says, Dido, what are you doing here? Surely you didn't kill yourself. I had no idea you were thinking of such a thing, right? And the readers, we, are left wondering, well, what does he mean? Has he forgotten? Aeneas does not only lie in love, he lies in politics. The most troubling instance, which I don't think anybody else has noticed yet, involves the false rationale he offers for fighting with the native Italians, a rationale upon which the entire moral weight of the Trojans' attack on the Italians must rely. In the text, Aeneas claims at least twice that the war in Italy started with a treaty that was broken by the Latins. As he says to the Latin delegation in book 11, quote, it's not your people whom I fight, it's your king who broke our ties and put his trust in Turnus's army, end quote. Earlier, while seeking Evander's favor, he had even represented the Latins as aggressors, quote, you see before you armed Trojans who are hostile to the Latins, who rudely drove us off, even though we're refugees, end quote. Unfortunately for these claims and for the moral justification for the fighting, there is no broken treaty, and there are no Latins who drive off innocent refugees. The reason is that Aeneas never fulfills the one condition of the treaty that he strikes with King Latinus, and therefore never seals the treaty. There is no treaty. The condition of the treaty was to meet Latinus in person and pledge his right hand to the deal. But Aeneas never actually meets Latinus at all. Now, everybody forgets this. Whoops, the death of Dido again. So here, for example, is an illustration I found on the internet, which shows us essentially Aeneas and Latinus and the exchange of gifts, right? But this never happened because the gifts were promised and never given. And as I've said, Aeneas never actually meets Latinus. The gifts are promised by his right-hand man, Ilioneus, okay? And that's when Latinus says, sure, I'll take the gifts and I'll make a treaty if your leader turns up and shakes hands with me himself. That's a condition of the treaty. Instead, events are interrupted when Ascanius, Aeneas's son, kills the gamekeeper's daughter's pet stag. So I'm not, sorry. The absence of this gesture of the shaken hand might seem to be a trivial matter, but it's actually standard Roman law around treatises. And in his recent book on the Roman treaty, Bill Gladwell has stressed the historical and political importance of this act of shaking hands in person, the Junctio Dextrarum, as one of the ways to cement a pact in Roman politics. So Gladwell doesn't even mention Aeneas and Latinus's supposed pact in Book 7 as a pact. He speaks of their pact as something occurring right at the end of the Aeneid in Book 12, where they say they're not going to fight, and that pact is broken shortly afterwards, even though there's been a long series of solemn oaths. So Aeneas has rendered his own battle against the Italians pious by representing it with a handy fiction, the pact. All these bothersome discrepancies and lies surely bring to mind that other famous vexed locus in the Aeneid, which of course is Aeneas's departure from the underworld through the ivory gates of false dreams in Aeneid 6, rather than through the horn gates of true dreams, which of course immediately suggests that the vision of Book 6 itself, and perhaps more, is a mirage. And this has been so difficult for many critics to accept that some of them have even amended the text and switched the gates around so that Aeneas goes out through the true gate and doesn't go out through the false gate, because that wouldn't make any sense, would it? There are more recent scholars who've also tried to explain it away in more subtle ways by suggesting that horn and ivory are not so different from each other, for example. But essentially, I don't think anybody's really given a satisfactory answer for the opposition of these two gates and the fact that Aeneas goes out, as it were, the wrong one. So, closing up, what's the implication if Aeneas shows himself repeatedly unreliable in reporting the narrative voices reality? What happens if we have no reason to believe the story he tells Dido any more than the story Sinon tells him? What if we end up thinking that he's not only a bit like Odysseus, but even a bit like the traitor of the pre-Virgilian tradition? Except for the word pious, and of course for Jupiter's support, Virgil may have made no significant moral changes to this character after all. He lies to everybody. He's considered an invader and a kidnapper. His stories don't match up. And the commentator Servius keeps having to pop in to remind us that we absolutely should not think of the other Aeneas, the earlier one. Now, for the wily Odysseus in the Greek context, this would all be less of a problem. His wiliness was celebrated from the very start. And our Andropolutropon, our silver-tongued storyteller, does not raise in us expectations of truth the way a pious man might. As Frederick All has pointed out, Odysseus's stories always take into account who his audiences are, what they will know and believe, and he changes his tales accordingly. But for the Romans, a pious man who lies might be a bit of a problem. Even in warfare, the question of Roman honor and truthfulness remained important. Consider, for example, the famous Roman hero Marcus Regulus, captured after a skirmish with the Carthaginians. After he was released, as it were, on parole to negotiate a peace with the Romans, he's supposed to have urged the Roman Senate to refuse the peace proposals, and then over the protests of his own people to have fulfilled the terms of his parole rather than break his word, which was by returning to Carthage, which he had promised to do. And at Carthage, according to Roman tradition and Livy, he was duly tortured to death, which he knew would happen. So I leave you with a question. Who is this Aeneas, Virgil's Aeneas? Did Virgil really write a new version of the legend exonerating him from the prior tradition? Yes, he added the word pious a bunch of times, and he made Jupiter pro-Aeneas and pro his takeover of Italy. But the poet also keeps thrusting the prior tradition in our face and lets us see that Aeneas lies when convenient. Is this then a sort of Aeneas Polytropos, as I ask in my title, a sort of Roman Odysseus? I would go further. I would suggest that Virgil opens up at least the possibility that this Aeneas, his Aeneas, is none other than the same Aeneas of the traitor tradition. The poem is simply about what happens when he finally makes it to Carthage from Troy and weaves a beautiful tale of sorrow, heroism, and loss to Dido in books 2 and 3, a tale that cannot be corroborated elsewhere. She likes the tale. She doesn't ask where the gifts are from. She blinds herself to the contradictions of the story because the gods make her fall in love with him. It's only after he abandons her that she says that she should never have listened to such an impious man in the first place. Then our hero takes off for Italy and lies there too. In sum, what if Virgil continues and does not reverse the tradition he knew, but in a very, very clever way? Thank you. I will stop my screen share now.
Thank you so much. That was brilliant. And I can see questions are coming in. I can see the virtual hand claps are going. So this is fantastic. I'm just going to open it up to anybody who might want to ask a question directly. You can unmute yourself. You can do that. You have the power. And in the meantime, I'm going to scroll through the few questions that are coming in already into the chat box. So would anybody like to ask a question directly? No. If you're happy for me to.
There's some good questions in the chat box.
They're already creeping in, and it's been fantastic. I was just keeping an eye on it there in the past few minutes. So if we start off with maybe Trisha's question, she was first in. What do you think of the contention that perhaps Turnus is actually the hero of the Aeneid rather than Aeneas?
Yeah, it's actually hard to find any true heroes in the poem because Turnus too acts in ways that we might find problematic. The distinction is that Turnus is deliberately driven mad by the Electo who comes to visit him and throws madness into him. At first he says, I don't want to fight those Trojans. And the next thing you know, he's leaping out of bed and shouting for his weapons, right? So Turnus has been infected with madness. That's part of the reason. Sorry. That's part of the reason for his aggression. Aeneas has not been infected with anything. He's in charge the whole time. So in a sense, one could certainly say that Turnus is an innocent victim of the god's will and of Aeneas's treachery. Yes.
Okay, fantastic. The next question that's come in, what are some books or articles that you would recommend on Aeneas's negative tradition?
There have been a few that have come out very recently. I would recommend The Virgilian Tradition by Richard Thomas, and I would recommend Death and the Optimistic Prophecy by Jim O'Hara. And I would also recommend, there's one more that's very important. Can't think of it, but all the articles by Sergio Casali, who's just obsessed with the idea that Turnus is a traitor.
Perfect. I'm writing those down as you talk as well. We have another question in thinking about the complexity, okay, of the word pious. How many meanings can it have depending on context? So our students, this is from one of our tutors at the Belfast Summer School, our students have been busy translating and learning grammar for the past week or so, and one question that keeps coming up has been whether one translation is better than another. So how do you choose one word over another when we're translating into English, I suppose, is the root there.
Yeah, really good question. Actually, in the translation, I follow a number of practices, one of which, for example, is keeping everything line to line so that it matches the original. But another thing I do is I identify words that not just me, everybody understands to be incredibly thematically and ethically significant in the text. And those words I always translate as the same word. Because I want the reader, even in the English, to be able to trace out the complex web of associations that Virgil creates throughout the poem. So let's take, of course, pious or pietas, right? Piety in English is not a good translation of that word because it means really respect and love for a Judeo-Christian God in a monotheistic religion. But piety in the epic is an incredibly important word, and I don't want to be switching around from, goodness to reverence to duty to love, or else that whole trail will get lost. So what I do is I use the awkward word piety, and then I have a lot of notes, in this case, a note explaining why I've done this and what the reader should look out for, and why I have chosen to use an ungainly word, an ugly word, really, even an out-of-date word throughout the epic. It's because I think the meaning of it has to be traced so carefully to see what Virgil is doing. I'll give you another example. Right at the beginning of the epic, when we're told about Aeneas's mission, we're told that his final destiny will be to found a city in Italy, right, which will be Rome. And the word for found in Latin is the verb condo, right, which can mean several things. It can mean to found a city. It can mean to compose a poem. And it can also mean to stick a sword in somebody's chest, right? So we've got condo at the beginning, founding of a city, and we've got condo in the very last lines as well, the exact same verb, but it doesn't mean found a city in the last lines. It means stick your sword in someone, because that's what Aeneas does to Turnus. So in the beginning, we see the poet using condo to create an image of the beginning of empire. And at the end, we see what this empire's foundation actually costs, right? The price is death, the death of the other. And the same verb is used for Aeneas murdering Turnus. So I had to think really hard about what verb could I pick that I could use in both places, right? To make sure that the readers got the connection. And in the end, I came up with the word plant, which isn't great, but it was the only thing I could find. So he plans to plant a city in Italy, and he planted his sword in Turnus's chest. So I guess the short answer to your question, which I should have given before the long answer, is that generally I will try to be, I will try not to be stiff, try to be very informal in my language, except for in the places where it's really important to what's going on in the action.
Yeah, and that's so vital. That's what with tutors, that's what we're instilling, hopefully, in our students at the BSS this year, of just how important it is your word choice and trying to be as idiomatic as possible, but
Yes,
trying to render those meanings that are there in Greek and Latin.
Right. So, for example, the word impious, you have to translate it as impious when Dido uses it that one time, because what Dido says is a rebuttal of everything Aeneas stands for. He's not pious Aeneas, he's impious, but she's the only one who actually has the guts to say it.
Of course, it would have to be a woman. Steve is asking, perhaps Virgil would have been able to make everything make more sense if he had time to fully revise the poem.
Yes, Steve, a lot of people ask that, and it's a very legitimate question. My answer, and some people would disagree, is that essentially the poem was finished in terms of its length, as we can see by that very loaded correlation of condo, right? So the revisions he would have made would have been to things like the half lines that he didn't finish, right? But would he have gone through, why is there this incredible network of details that insistently point back to the prior tradition? It's not just once or twice. It's not a boo-boo that Virgil made when he wasn't paying attention. It is thrust in our faces if you know how to look for it. And it's throughout all the most important moments of the poem. The justification for war, the justification for leaving Dido, the whole idea that it was pious for the Trojans to come and take over the native Italians' land by claiming that the native Italians had violated a treaty. That sounds like something that might have come out of the early Americans speaking to the first peoples of this country, right? So my answer is it's too systematic to have been something that he would have cleaned up. It looks completely deliberate.
That's great. Tony, one of our fantastic Greek students, we hear that translators don't read other translations while they are at work. Did you follow that procedure? or did you go and compare and contrast? I know myself as translator, I certainly do my homework beforehand as well to see what other people have used
Oh,
to
yes.
kind of, you know, get that inspiration as well, or to see maybe where people fall short, in my opinion, or where people really excel. So I know I certainly do compare. How about you?
I did as well, definitely, for several reasons. One, I didn't want to inadvertently recreate somebody else's line and be accused of plagiarism. But more importantly than that, I really wanted to see how Aeneas looked and what sort of language was used about him in most of the translations. And almost, well, all but one of the translations I looked at were done by male scholars, and some of them were quite old, you know, dating back a century or so. And they managed somehow to all convey that Aeneas is a really good guy by not doing things like repeating words such as dissimulate in the text, where I think it's very important that Aeneas says to his men, let's dissimulate. And then Dido says, well, why did you dissimulate? And he says, I never dissimulated. It's right there in the text, right? So for me, having realized that, it became more important to make sure that certain things that were in the text that hadn't really been seen before could be seen. And if it was a little bit too hard to be seen, then of course I would just write a long note. The other thing I was trying to do is I was trying to make the poem match the original line for line. And that's difficult because Latin is so much more compact than English, of course. And again, almost all the other translations are about a third or a half longer than the Virgilian version. And the reason that matters is because the reading experience becomes completely different. I mean, imagine if each line is a third longer, or if the whole epic is a third longer, it becomes a slightly more trudging experience. And the Aeneid is not a trudging experience. It's this really fast-paced, dramatic, kind of, you know, gobsmack you story full of amazing things going on at the same time. And so part of what I wanted to do was avoid the heaviness that I felt when looking at those other translations as well.
I think Martin's asked a question. You said that the negative tradition was not part of your initial learning. Why do you think the negative tradition has been, quote, hidden?
Very good. So the negative tradition was not only pre-Virgilian, it also popped up in the Middle Ages, where people seemed very keen on the idea of Aeneas as a traitor for some reason, but it has been suppressed essentially in the scholarship, or just hasn't been seen as important in the scholarship. I wouldn't say so much that the negative tradition has been hidden. I would say that we've all been brainwashed into thinking that the Aeneid couldn't possibly contain such material. And there's reasons why we've all been brainwashed. Think of it, right there in the poem, first thing we're told about Aeneas, he's pious. The narrator tells us he's pious and repeats it 20 times. So who are we to contradict? That's one thing. Second, Augustus, under whom the poem was written, loved the poem apparently, and he saved it from being consigned to the flames, which is what Virgil wanted to do with it, and he had it made part of the school curriculum, as we know from contemporary witnesses. So if Augustus liked it so much, who are we to say that, you know, he was not right, right? What else? The commentator tradition. Every time the commentators comment about the poem, they say it was written in order to praise Augustus in the guise of Aeneas, right? And that's why you can't take anything negatively, because if it was written to praise Augustus, why would we have all this bad stuff in there, right? And then what else is there? There's the fact that Jupiter approves of the takeover of Italy. And so when Jupiter says things like go and conquer Italy, we assume it's a good thing, a morally good thing. But the Greco-Roman gods were not morally good in that sense, right? But between the fact that Augustus liked it, there's piety everywhere, it was used in the schools to boost the Augustan regime, was kind of ignored by scholars, the commentator tradition didn't agree with it, and Jupiter backs the whole thing against Juno. I think all of this has really put us into a mold where it's very hard to think that something else might be going on. And so we just don't see the stuff in the text because we're conditioned to read by those little moments of discomfort.
Okay, yeah, that's really interesting. I never thought about it that way, but yeah, absolutely. Brainwashing is a nice way to put it, actually. Liliana, how much are Aeneas's lying habits simply Virgil attempting to create a more human hero compared to the Homeric heroes? In the same way that Aeneas is overcome by furor throughout. Just read it through. Sorry, just lost my place there. The screen is playing up. Yeah, so how much do you think that's impacted this kind of change from the Homeric hero style?
So I guess this question is about seeming like a normal human fallible person, right? And whether or not these moments in the text could be put there in order to make Aeneas just seem kind of more fallible, right? I don't know. I think there's a bit too much fallibility, including the end, in which the furor that has driven Juno since the beginning of the poem, and that also drives the epic action, right? It's furor that makes everything happen. It's a woman's furor specifically. At the end of the poem becomes a man's furor. In fact, the furor of the hero as he kills a suppliant enemy after his father, in book 6, of course, has told him to spare the defeated as part of what it means to be a Roman, or what Romans will do. So, and then I don't know, it doesn't just seem like normal human failing. You don't have sex with a queen of Carthage and then just sail off. That's just not right, right? Even Odysseus didn't simply abandon Calypso. He spoke to her nicely and said, "Sorry, I've got to be off. Thanks a lot for the hospitality. Bump into you later, maybe." But Aeneas just descends into legal language, doesn't show that he's upset at all, and then sneaks off without telling her. She sees him from the window. So I think the readers who have a negative reaction to that, even if they can't always articulate why, actually are on the right side. I think it's problematic. There's also the issue that we've got two different opinions from two different goddesses, right? Juno says, "I'm going to have Dido and Aeneas sleep together, and I'm going to marry them." She says they will be married, using, they'll be in connubious, and the nymphs howl from the hilltops in recognition of their marriage and so forth. Venus says they're going to have a great time. I'm going to make her fall in love with him so that she won't hurt him while he's in Carthage, because the Carthaginians are tricky, right? But they're not going to be married. So Dido says, "Why are you leaving? We're married." She's got Juno's point of view. Aeneas says, "I never married you." He's got Venus's point of view. But who are we to decide which goddess has the rights to determine what the truth is? So it's left vague like that.
It plays into the whole, the bit I think that a lot of students forget, and that even a lot of us scholars forget, that these gods are not the moral kind, as you mentioned, or
they're not the moral gods.
Are
no.
using these humans, even heroes, as playthings.
Absolutely, and that goes all the way back to Homer, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So that continuation is definitely present. I think if you don't mind, one more maybe, just to wrap things off, and then I think we've exhausted your time and your wonderful presentation. Steve is asking, why do you think Ovid doesn't make more out of Virgil's Mendathasti in Heroides number 7? Dido seems just to go around and around in circles.
Oh, he does. Both in Heroides 7 and in the Metamorphoses, Ovid does some really strange things that corroborate Dido's version of the story and not Aeneas's. And there's an article about this. I'm trying to remember who wrote it, specifically about Ovid, Virgil, and Heroides and the Metamorphoses. And I'm trying to in Heroides 7. And the only way of reading that to make sense is that the auctor has to be Aeneas in some weird sense, which doesn't make make good sense at all. But if you read Outdoor as Virgil, then Dido gets to say that she was betrayed by Virgil, who misrepresented her story and made her look like, you know, somebody who wasn't married and who was hysterical and was chasing after Aeneas and all this. And there's more to it than that. But Ovid really pushes back against Virgil's Aeneas.
That's fantastic. There's loads of comments coming in that they've really not only enjoyed your lecture, but a fantastic Q&A.
They were great questions. Thank you so much.
Fantastic points here, and it's great to see so many people engaging with this content and finding the answers so wonderfully thought out and drawing our own conclusions from this. This has been fantastic. I would just love to take the opportunity to thank you on behalf of Belfast Classics and all the tutors at the Belfast Summer School this year for coming along and giving us your time and your wonderful research this afternoon. We very much appreciate it. So thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to have you. We're very honoured to have you here, and our students, I know, are very lucky. Over 60 participants. That was incredible. We are absolutely thrilled. So thank you.
Thank you all so much for the fantastic questions and the chance to talk about bad Aeneas. Well okay, bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Goodbye now.
Thumbs up on that.